Hello and welcome to News 24's Frontline. My name is Kyle Cowan. I'm an investigative reporter based in Johannesburg. I'm joined today by auditor, activist, prolific tweeter, and Power FM presenter Kaya Sitole, as well as senior investigative reporter for Fin24, Jan Cronje. And we want to talk about private sector collusion. We all, as South Africans, know about state capture and the damage that this has wrought on our country and our economies. And I want to ask my panelists today some very important questions about how these things happened. How does it happen that a family or a group of companies can extract money from the state, from government coffers, from taxpayers' money? And I want to start with this. 874 pages, the first part of the Zondo Commission's report, which has given us staggering insight into some of these things. And Jan, I want to start with you, and I want to ask you about Bain and Company. I want to ask, how does a consultancy firm meet the president of South Africa? Let's start there. How do you get in the room?
Afternoon, Kyle. Yes, one of the findings of the commission was that before Tom Moyane was appointed as the commissioner of SARS, he and President Zuma met with Bain. Now, Kyle, for our viewers that don't know Bain, it's a US consultancy. It works internationally, and it's I guess you could say it's one of the most reputable international consultancies. And their South African office started meeting with Moyane and Zuma in the months before Moyane was appointed as SARS commissioner. And Zondo, in his findings, said that this was odd. This is not usually the way that things are supposed to happen. And Bain appears to have known that Moyane would be appointed commissioner. Obviously, this is a very important job in South Africa, the commissioner of the Revenue Service, months before he actually was. So, Kyle, as to how you get in the room with Zuma, it appears to be that Zuma and Moyane were very close, and Moyane and Bain became very close. And according to the findings, at least, all of them met at least once before Moyane was appointed.
Mm-hmm. And we now know that some of those meetings were not really about, hey, look at us, we're Bain, and this is what we can do, Kaya. These meetings were effectively to set out a strategy and a roadmap in how to take what is the engine room of the South African economy, the tax collecting agency, and change it from top to bottom. Why would you want to change the way a tax agency works in the first place?
Yeah. So I think for me, the story has always fascinated me because if you remember where it all originated from, it actually originates from a telephone call that was recorded. And that was a telephone call involving the previous commissioner of SARS, Opa Mahashula, offering someone whom I happen to know personally a job at the agency. And of course, the question of how that got leaked itself then essentially started giving you insights into what the turf wars were at that point in time. Now, the reality here is that of all the institutions of state that the government has tried to make work, the collections agency is remarkably important because unlike every other institution of state, it is essentially the one that enables politicians to retain their political power by being able to obviously direct the policy of what our tax revenues ought to do. So I would say in the hierarchy of state institutions, this is a remarkably important one. And of course, if you go back and sort of look at the history of how that recording involving Opa Mahashule came into the public domain, it does appear that SARS had, as part of its own way of doing things, decided that they wanted to be able to do things in a particular way. Some people may not have liked that, and then we started essentially having the spy wars that were happening in the background. And of course, at some point in time, somebody needed to use that in order to be able to exile Obama from the office of the Commissioner of SARS. The development from that point in time then becomes a matter of, well, if this is an institution that is so critical and it's an institution that is so important, firstly, any politician of the day, in other words, any president of the day, would want to have the type of person that they get along with to be in charge of that particular agency, if for no other reason, just because it is an important agency. Now, of course, if you come in as the president of the country and your name is President Jacob Zuma, and there is a vacancy at the SARS office, you're obviously going to start looking out and start feeling out about who you may want to nominate or appoint to that particular position. So up until that point in time, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that particular process. We needed a SARS commissioner. Magashule was not there, so there was definitely a void. Then the secondary question then becomes that in then trying to identify and earmark an individual, what then became the process? And that for me is where the things got a bit muddied, because of course Mr. Moyane was doing a job at the Correctional Services Department, and within the ANC's architecture of reasoning, they were always going to find someone who is affiliated with the party in one way or another. Again, absolutely no red flags until that point in time. But perhaps what becomes the interest, the red flag moment here, is the fact that it doesn't look like the president took the view that I'm simply looking for a commissioner to go and continue whatever has been going on at SARS, but rather I need to be able to firstly have an intimate understanding of what this organization does, and then be able to find an individual that's going to be able to either continue what it does or simply change the way things are done. So in my view, that probably became the entry point for these deliberations to say, wait, hold on, let me get a clear understanding of what this thing does in the first place, so that by the time I say to the public that I think this is the guy that needs to run it, he has a clear understanding of what my expectations are as the president of the country. And that for me would have been the entry point into the conversation between the president of the republic and a consulting company. How Bain put its hands up and said, we want to be that consulting company, is something that only the Italian job can resolve for us. And that, of course, will be an extradition of the man who's off in Italy now to come back and tell us what happened.
Yeah, and wouldn't we all like that, just to understand this? And Bain has responded, in recent days after the release of the report, to say, look, we published these extensively detailed affidavits, and it doesn't look like Zondo took it into account. And then we have the next sort of tail into the story, because we know what happened with Bain. So there's two very important issues. First of all, there's a procurement problem. Okay, you've identified this consultancy. You've had your 17 shadowy meetings in the space of 20 months or whatever it was, and you've now identified the person who's going to be the next SARS commissioner, and you are all now colluding in dark rooms, or in this case, it would probably be some very nicely furnished boardrooms, and you have now decided how to restructure SARS. But now there's a procurement problem, and a 6-week contract becomes a 27-month contract for 164 million rand, which Bain has now paid back with interest. But Jan, tell me about procurement processes. Isn't it right that if SARS wanted to restructure and they needed a consulting company, they would have, in the normal course, gone out to open tender, they would have received bids, they would have evaluated them and chosen the people that they thought were best capable of helping them restructure SARS? In this case, that didn't happen, did it?
No, Kyle, you are quite right. That's how a tender should be run. What is interesting in the report's findings is that Zondo actually heard evidence from many witnesses that said that SARS in late 2013, early 2014, when Moyane arrived, didn't need to be restructured. It certainly didn't need this massive restructuring that actually took place. But in any case, if there were to be a restructuring, the correct way to do it would be to put it out to tender, would be to have different people accept bids. It would have to go through a board. It's a long, drawn-out process that is, should be well known to everyone as it's encoded in law. But Kyle, you're right that didn't take place with Bain. And Bain's short contract, as you noted earlier, of just a few weeks was extended for many months. They ended up earning, as you said, 160 odd million, which they paid back eventually. But problems with procurement, Kyle, is certainly one of the main threads that Zondo has identified. running through the whole report. It's not something that only happened at SARS.
Of journalist existence is procurement problems. I mean that's almost all that we deal with that exclusively day in and day out. And Kaya, I want to bring you in on this. I want to read you a quote, and it goes as follows. And it said, "We asked if we believe that the architecture and system of business is inherently corrupt. And from where we are sitting as BLSA, we say no. The architecture and system of business is not inherently corrupt." This was the CEO of BLSA, Busi Mavuso. She was speaking on 702's Money Show with Bruce Whitfield yesterday afternoon. Bain is a consultancy company, Kyle. Their chief job is to make money.
Yeah.
That's what they go out, they find work to do, they make money. In the drive to make money and in the drive to competition, these consultancy firms often cut corners. And that's been gracious to Bain in this sense.
Yeah.
What do we need to change in the way that the private sector does work with government to stop these situations where a relationship between two people can be the deciding factor on contracts with hundreds, if not billions of rands?
Okay. Yeah, that's a remarkably important deliberation. But before then, I sort of want to tap onto the general conversation around procurement. And of course, I mean, everybody acknowledges that you definitely want to have the most transparent and the most, cost-effective tender processes to be run. But again, in relation to SARS in particular, in relation to the South African Reserve Bank and probably also the State Security Agency, there are indeed in some cases legitimate reasons for not publicizing exactly what it is that you're trying to put together. So of course, if I'm going to say that, for example, I want to start a high-risk investigation unit within SARS that's going to do X, Y, and Z, it's probably not desirable for me to publish that tender out for public consumption so that all the thieves that I'm trying to trap eventually now know exactly what it is that needs to be done. So again, within the spectrum of this particular conversation, there could have been legitimate reasons for the way things were done. What remains elusive here is a very cogent explanation for no, we felt that in this particular instance, the information was so sensitive. We did an internal preliminary vetting as SARS, for example, and we came up with 3 or 4 consulting firms. And after we approached them, only then did Bain emerge. If that was a story, then fine, we'd understand what happened here. But it looks like Bain, for some odd example, was essentially earmarked not because there was a pre-existing spec that says this is what needs to be done, but because somebody says, we need you guys to come and tell us what to do in order to do things differently. And the main limitation here, and I think you get that a lot from the testimonies of the people that have been part of the SARS architecture, is that in the absence of Bain having come to SARS and say, okay, please tell us how this works in the first place, no one knows what the basis for them providing insights and advice to the president in the first place could have ever been. Tom Moyane had never been part of SARS, it was at Correctional Services. So that's where the problem with Bain comes in that this was not an ordinary process where they could have said, well, actually, we've worked with governments where the type of information that was being distilled was so sensitive, then an open tender process could have been departed from. We would happily understand that. I don't want to know how spies are selected and how spies do their work. I'm happy for that not to be an open tender. It's those limited instances of justification within the procurement space. So they do exist. In this case, we do not believe that this was the issue here. But when we do talk about the whole procurement process, remember, guys, the biggest problem that we have with capitalism in charge is the very nature of capitalism is all these competitive instincts, in that if there is indeed going to be a tender that says that we're looking for a consulting company to do X, Y, and Z, I need to be able to win the tender. And if it turns out that on the price alone, I'm unlikely to succeed, then the first question is, can I tap into my pre-existing networks that can be able to sort of give me a leg up in relation to the people that will have to making the call? And that is why people within the consulting firm prize their social networks so dearly, because they know that at some point in time, eventually all the auditing firms and the consulting firms are probably going to submit the same ballpark when it comes to the pricing dimensions. Then the bigger question is, what does give you the leg up? And it's your ability to leverage pre-existing relationships to say, wait, hold on, even though my competitors have quoted the same price, we have the expertise, because look at our reference. So if your referee is another state-owned enterprise where the CEO of company B can call the CEO of company and say, wait, how well did they execute when they were doing the job? Then that gives it the leg up. So those types of arrangements and those types of backroom deals are actually inherent into how people engage in public sector contracts, and particularly the companies that we refer to as a consulting firm have mastered the art. It's not just them, because the one interesting, a job description that you find even within the big banks is this thing called the business development officer, the public sector business development officer. In other words, that is essentially a person that institution goes out and says, we need to be able to have a leg up when it comes to public sector procurement. Do you have some pre-existing relationships or some pre-existing engagements with people that are critical decision makers within that government business, and therefore that's why we need you? So if you're talking about Bosasa, I think his name was Lishabane. If you're looking at all the other, if you're looking at a Nedbank, for example, the name Eric Wood comes through as a person who, you wanted to have insight into what Eric Wood's thinking was, because Eric Wood is the one that ultimately advises people on what to do. If you look at how regiments was put together, it was on the basis that, well, all the guys that were associated with regiments had very strong political affiliations with the critical decision makers of the day. If you look at companies like Tebe, for example, companies like that, what gives these companies a leg up when the competitive landscape is so linear is the simple fact that they've got access to those political networks, those social networks that are able to then sway the decisions in their favor. And that remains a fundamental limitation of how procurement works. And in the absence of that sense of discretion that a bid adjudication committee, for example, or bid evaluation committee is able to apply, then we're always going to have this problem, because it is when the discretion creeps in where they then say, okay, since everybody's on level 1 BE and since everyone has quoted this particular price, this is why company A should get in. It's that element of discretion where you then have to ask, wait, hold on, if everybody's being evaluated on an equal basis and the answers are the same, how do you then decide that company A should get it at the expense of company B?
To weigh in on this afterwards, and we'll come back to the banks and we'll come back to Business Leadership South Africa. But is the answer then not to make all of these processes far more transparent? And you've mentioned this, you've said that there are certain cases where business strategy is involved. You can't go and advertise to the entire market exactly what you're looking at procuring over the next quarter or the next three years or so on. But if there is a higher degree of public input, where people like Kaya and people like Jan can sit and look at these processes and say, Bain and Company, no, I don't think they've really got any expertise at all in the affairs of a tax agency. Maybe they're not the best company to do this. Shouldn't this answer be that we all need to have a say in these contracts? Is that just too burdensome?
Well, I would certainly like to see the contracts being more open for us journalists. As you know, it's often very, very difficult to get basic information about tenders. The government does put out tender bulletins, and often information in tenders is only included in annual reports, which are published way after the tenders have started. I don't think that the government's current tender database site, there was an attempt to pull all tenders together on a treasury site, as you know. It's not really very easy to work and get an overview of the...
Jan, to be frank, it's completely useless. Let's be frank, it's completely useless.
So certainly, Kyle, I'm not sure if I think public input in tenders would be a bridge too far for executives and boards of companies, but certainly making tender information available would be a great help in just getting everyone on the same page about what the tender is for, how long, and who's in the running.
But that implies that accountability comes after the fact. Kaya, what do you think about higher public participation in contracts that are so important to our country, specifically Bain and so on?
Look, I think in an ideal utopia, we would have the type of insights that enable us to be able to understand what value these companies are delivering. But yet again, I think we're probably going to have to navigate between the limitations imposed by the fact that there's unlikely to ever be the type of business decisions that everybody is happy to say the public should know from start to finish what it is that we're doing and how we're doing it. Even if you'd say that government departments do not have competition, there are some particular intellectual property issues associated with that. If you look at SASSA, for example, so when SASSA works as a state security agency, you might imagine that absolutely nobody is trying to compete with them. But if they then give us insights into saying that actually the person that runs the social payments system on our behalf has got access to these data sets and those data points, then it may be of interest to other people who are not necessarily interested in the payment cycle, but rather the value of the data associated with that. So there's always going to be that particular spectrum. On the question of whether the public should have greater insight into what these organizations are actually contracting for and what the value is. Well, I suppose the answer exists, and yet the answer is meaningless, because between the Auditor General and the Accountant General, surely we have enough insights into saying, wait, hold on, I, as a citizen, have seen that that particular department has advertised a tender for an amount of 200 or 300 million rand. I think that it's in the public interest for us to have an insight into what that tender is about. I don't have to read all 800 pages of it, but I need to be able to get a summary of saying that actually this was the tender spec that was put up, these are the people that bid, and this is a company that won. In fact, in some cases, you do stumble upon this information. I remember a couple of years ago, I stumbled upon the information relating to the Government Pensions Administration Agency, which had put out a tender for a building close to R1 billion. And that tender, they had published the results of it. And when I looked at who had won the tender, it turned out to be a lone ranger who didn't own a single building to his name. So, of course, Twitter being what it was, we started asking questions on Twitter, and that tender was withdrawn because clearly there was a whole lot of fraud going on in the background, and they simply withdrew it. So I think in some instances, we've been fortunate enough to stumble upon that information, but it's clearly not a uniform process, which is to say that every single government department that does issue a tender of beyond 10 million or 20 million has got the responsibility to then say, after the tender has been awarded, these are the final 3 or 4 companies that made it to the short list, and this is the company that won. And only then, if I have that historical knowledge to say, wait, hold on, I worked for that company last week, I know very well that we do not have the capacity to execute on this, can I then say, please explain to me how a company with such limited resources, with such limited insights was able to do this. Currently, that process is supposed to be the due diligence that gets undertaken internally. So, of course, in the SAA case, that is what you hear about the whole Seacrest example, about the Free State Development Corporation, about Cynthia Stimpel's testimony, where she says that, well, as part of my job, I needed to be able to say, we've designed the tender spec, but the people that are bidding need to have an ability to execute on this. And from what I can see, the fact that they can't even tell me what it is that they can execute on, I have to gravitate towards saying, well, you can't possibly execute on this because there's no track record. So internally within the systems, it ought to happen. But again, the fact that you now know who Cynthia Stimpel is simply means that she's an outsider, she's an outlier, rather than the way things are done within the public procurement system.
Well, I mean, the entire system is based on the integrity of the people dealing with the specific contract in front of them. And as we know in South Africa, the integrity is not always where we would want it to be. You know, people do things for personal gain. They do things for political gain. They are bullied. They are intimidated. They are forced. They are threatened. And at the end of the day, what happens is, you know, if one group of companies can get it right, you have something called state capture. And they end up taking over swaths of business. And this is what's always fascinated me. And I want to bring it back now, Kaya, if you please, to what Business Leadership South Africa has been saying about Bain and Company. Because she said during the radio interview yesterday, and I'm quoting, we being BLSA, agree that Bain has committed terrible crimes. But if we are going to look at who needs to be put behind bars and pay for this, I would put it to you that there would have to be individuals. You would have to go after those people that are responsible for these heinous crimes. Now, the question, of course, is why is BLSA continuing to associate themselves with Bain? And perhaps this argument can be seen in the sense that, okay, well, Bain has cleaned up their act and they've apologized and they've paid back the money. But this leads us to a bigger question. What should happen to these consulting companies like McKinsey, like Bain, the auditing companies, PwC, KPMG, after they have been caught out? Because the apology only ever comes after they are caught out. What should happen to these companies? Is it okay to say the corrupt are gone?
Well, I have a bit of delicate problem when it comes to BLSA, because for me, what they have said about Bain is not exactly surprising, because I think it was just around 3 years ago when essentially the same thing happened with KPMG. Now, obviously, I was very intimately engaged in trying to understand what had happened at KPMG and how KPMG had undertaken to reform itself. And even I was surprised by the fact that while that process was still ongoing, BLSA then took the view that they wanted to bring KPMG back into the fold. And when the questions were then asked about, well, what is it that you've seen about KPMG that suddenly warrants them being part of BLSA, we essentially got the same answers to say that as far as we're concerned, it was not an institutional thing, it was an individual thing. So it does appear that BLSA is simply sticking to the script. That is how they evaluate these problems. My point of departure with BLSA, however, is a simple reality in that I do not believe that they should impose upon themselves the burden for saying to the public that this company is sufficiently reformed, because the damage that had been caused, and this is what I said when they did this to KPMG, I said the damage had not been caused to BLSA, the damage had been caused to society. So for me, the reference point should be, do South African citizens feel that Bain has repented for what it did? Do South African citizens feel that KPMG has been adequately rehabilitated? That should be the primary prism for engaging in this conversation at BLSA, rather than them gravitating towards saying, well, tell us how good you are now and tell us that you fight XYZ, then we're good to go. Because for me, that seems to be missing the point. The point here was not the fact that the money was taken out of state coffers, because the money is back. If that had been the only problem, wouldn't be here. The issue here is that in the process of extracting so much out of the state, the only reason these companies have paid it back is simply because they got caught. It's not because they underwent this evolution in their thinking, to quote the former President Jacob Zuma, and then simply said they don't need to pay back. No, it's only when they get caught, when they do these particular things. So for some reason, it looks like the basis for embracing companies is much lower when it comes to BLSA than it is when it comes to society. The other interesting point here is that every single company in the country and every single company in the world actually exists on the basis of two discrete licenses. The first one is the commercial license, which is a simple question of, do you have a value, or do you have a business that's worth anything to society, to people at large? So, of course, the commercial license works on the basis that, yes, for as long as there's a demand for consulting services and you offer consulting services, then you've got a commercial viability component. What is also quite important, however, is what we refer to as a social license, which is essentially the sense of legitimacy associated with your business. I can tell you right now that there's a huge demand for illegal drugs and narcotics out there in the world. So there's definitely a commercial viability for drugs and drug traffickers. However, it is not socially desirable to have that. So that's why we frown upon those businesses, even though if I did the spreadsheets, I could tell you, damn, this is probably one of those profitable businesses you could come up with. So it's always very important to be able to distinguish between the conversation here. We're not disputing the commercial viability of a company like Bain. We are simply saying that perhaps a company that has done so much damage to a country's fundamental institutions should not have the social license and the social legitimacy to simply operate as if nothing went wrong and simply say, but we paid back the money, so what more do you want? For me, that seems to be the lowering of the country's moral barometer, and it doesn't help that our business leaders, through their proxy and their representation at BLSA, seem to believe that the bar can be lowered that much. It'll be very interesting to ask them what they understand was the reason Bell Pottinger went down. Because again, with Bell Pottinger, I can give you a list of the individuals that are in charge of the Gupta account. I can give you the list of the individuals that are in charge of crafting together a particular strategy. So surely if Bell Pottinger simply said, well, we've fired Victoria, we've got rid of these people, Bell Pottinger should have been allowed to remain viable. That seems to be the prism from which BLSA approaches these things. But of course, that wasn't the case. there was a universal consensus that the damage that they had done to society was so fundamental and corrosive, this business ought to have lost its social license to exist. And once they lost their social license, it didn't matter how many other clients they had in their books. That's when the commercial license itself essentially dissipated. BLSA seems to operate from a different environment. They seem to be operating from a different universe compared to the rest of us as society. But hey, that's why they make the type of money that they do, and we sit here deliberating.
Jan, I want to bring you in on this, and I want to ask you a very simple question. If a company like Bain has lost its license to operate in our society, as Kaya has so eloquently put it now, what should we do as South Africans, as the public? What should we do about a company like Bain? Should we demand that this company never, ever does work for any company or public entity in this country again? Or should we march to their offices and throw eggs at them? What do you think is the answer to accountability when the leaders of business in this country, as Kaya just set it out, seem to be operating on a completely different plane from the rest of us?
Yeah, Kyle, that's a great question. I do think that there always has to be a way out for companies that have been fingered in reports like the State Capture Commission and others. There has to be a route for them to reform and become members of society again, because if not, it will not be in their interests to come clean, tell the whole story, pay back the money and things like that. As to what that route will take, I think that's difficult to say, but it certainly has to be full disclosure of absolutely everything that happened. Now, with the example of Bain, Kyle, I don't think that has happened. I don't. In a previous report by Judge Nugent, he came to the conclusion that Bain hadn't told the full story, to him at least, which is partly why Zondo investigated Bain more in the state capture report. So I don't think that Bain started well. They should have come clean to Nugent from the beginning. I don't know if there's absolute clarity over what or how those initial meetings with Moyane and Zuma were initiated. So I think that certainly one of the things has to be full disclosure. Obviously, money that was illegally awarded in illegal contracts has to be paid back. I think that those are two things. As for the rest, maybe there can be something like a cooling off period, like you have in rugby or something, where you for 3 years you cannot bid for government contracts or anything. It obviously has to be something that applies to everyone at the same time. But I do think that it's important for companies to see that they can be reintegrated in society at some stage. I just think that look, we're all still, I guess, considering how that can be done.
And just before we move into the last section, we've discussed Bain at length, and Bain is effectively a consultancy company, which has always been a very vague term to me, until you actually start speaking to the people and understanding what exactly do they consult on. But I want to talk about auditors and banks, just very quickly, because all of these companies are audited by seemingly well-respected, well-funded, well-staffed, knowledgeable and experienced auditing companies. Yet somehow the money still makes its way out of the bank accounts. And that's where the banks come in, because the banks allow this money to be moved around. They are often, as we've seen with Nedbank, they are to a level involved in some very strange transactions where full disclosures are not made, and then years after the fact are still maintaining that they did absolutely nothing wrong and that this is all normal. But there are laws in South Africa, Kaya, that prevent people from moving around ill-gotten gains. And the obligation falls on auditors and banks to firstly pick up these anomalies and secondly report them. Does that happen? Or are we effectively waiting are the banks effectively waiting until they're caught before saying, oh dear, we better shut down these bank accounts. Is that that's the sense I get. What do you think?
Well, you said there are laws that prevent all these amounts of money being shifted around. I would say that there are no such laws. The laws exist to prevent you and I from doing it, because you would think that anecdotally, when we start talking about the amounts of money that are involved in this, surely that shouldn't even be a starter. There shouldn't be a single bank that allows you to come and say, can I do a withdrawal of 5 million rand without them asking exactly where you are going to take this amount of money. So I think the one good example of that is in the SA Express chapter of the State Capture Report, where there was this one lady, and I remember her testimony because it baffled me, where she sort of runs the cash movement business. So in the cash movement business, people call her in the morning and then they say, look, I've got a million rand that I need to move from one place to another. I'll send it to you or I'll deliver it to you. A very, very strange state of affairs. But that testimony for me didn't get the type of attention that it warranted, because what it says here is that we do have this parallel financial world where I suppose that's where drug dealers tend to thrive. And some people may say that I keep harping back on drug dealers. But anyway, as it turns out, it's very strange that you've got a system that enables people to be able to say to a bank, I'd like to withdraw hard currency of 1 million or 2 million rand because I need to do X, Y, and Z. Because at some point in time, you'd have thought that the banking system itself would have said that it's in our collective interest to eliminate the prevalence and the proliferation of that parallel market. So if you come to us and you want to argue that the reason you need 1 million rand in hard currency is because you decided to pay your wages in cash, then no. We are actually going to assist you to onboard those employees onto the formal system so that there is reduced risk for us and a reduced risk for you. Because if you are the person that's known to be paying wages of 1 million rand in hard currency every single Friday, eventually somebody will start tracking your movements and you're at risk. So you'd have thought that even the banking system would have taken the view to say, we no longer believe that it is actually practical or sensible for us to be able to enable anyone to withdraw that amount of money in hard currency, because there shouldn't be any type of transactions that warrant that using hard currency. We're still not there yet. So what we end up with is that we end up with this very, very glorified box ticking exercise, which simply means that every bank will say, but you as a government told us that we must simply know our customer. We asked him what he does, and he said that that's the business that he runs. We do not have the investigating capability or the authority to go and follow him and see if he actually pays those wages to 10 employees, as he said. So as far as he's made his declarations to say that, no, I'm running a legitimate business, as far as we know our customer based on his disclosures, that's where our responsibility as an institution ends. So what you are seeing here is that within the entire ecosystem, there are far too many gaps in that particular process, where I will say that my duty as an auditor was to simply comment on the transactions as they were recorded. I can't imagine that anyone would think that I'm responsible for imagining things that were done parallel or outside of the system. So therefore, I'm going to limit my focus, I'm going to limit my scope to what went into this company's records and express an opinion on that. The bankers themselves will say, well, all we had to do was simply validate that there was enough money in the bank account for us to finalize that transaction. It went to another bank account. It went to another counterparty. We do not have the authority as ABSA to dig into standard bank systems and tell us who exactly that recipient is. Are you guys comfortable with that person? So because there's all these disconnects in the system, everybody gets away with simply saying that I did my job. And we still don't have any law that says, no, you should have done more, because everybody says, but on what basis should I have done more? So the system has been strategically fragmented in such a way where accountability quite simply does not exist on a universal basis. So banks will legitimately come and argue that, well, they did what they were able to do within the ambit of what they're capable of doing. And one example that they'll give you is that any system that says that they should be able to tap into each other's systems brings anti-competitive conduct concerns into it. So therefore, the Competition Commission will say, wait, hell no, you guys seem to be colluding in the exchange of information. Because the problem would be, once you start exchanging that information, what other information you exchange? So rather than gravitate into the territory, we simply stay outside and say, just don't get into those engagements, which simply means that the system remains broken and fragmented to the detriment of society.
Yeah, and I think to fix that in a sort of sense, we have the FIC, right, which looks at some transactions. It's got oversight into all money flows in and out of the country and within our borders, and it files suspicious transaction reports. And as we all know, the FIC is a very mysterious sort of element of national treasury and our government, but they do a very core job. But then they file these suspicious transaction reports with the police, and then nothing happens. And Jan, I wonder, what can we do to step up accountability? If 100 suspicious transaction reports are being filed per day, but our police don't have the capacity to investigate it, we are left with what?
Right.
Holding them publicly accountable through the media?
Certainly, that is one option, Kyle. And you're quite right when you talk about the fact that they file many reports with police, or they pass on information to police, and often nothing happens afterwards. It's a bit difficult to know what can be done. As South Africans, I guess what we could do is try and pressure the people that have the purse strings, so that's government, to give more money to forensic investigators in the Hawks, at the FIC, at all other government departments. A problem, of course, with South Africa, Kyle, is that all sections of the government need money, and there isn't funding. South Africa's got a massive debt burden, as you know. But what the MPA and what others have complained of in the past is this lack of forensic accounting ability. So maybe it would be possible to have some kind of public-private partnership where forensic auditors from the private sector are loaned to government for periods of time. Obviously, that would have to be done. Absolutely everything would have to be above board. It's tricky when the private sector gets involved with work that should ideally be done by government. But we certainly need a better investigative capacity, and it's a difficult question. I don't know the answer for it.
Yeah, I mean, it is one of the most important problems of that I think that we will see coming out of the Zondo Commission report is actually implementing recommendations. But unfortunately, we do have to leave it there. And to thank you to everyone for tuning in. Thank you, Kaya. Thank you, Jan, for your time and for your fantastic insights. We will take this conversation up again. There are still 2 parts of the Zondo Commission report to come, and it will undoubtedly give us a far deeper insight into what has happened at other state-owned institutions and companies. And at that point, I think we'll reconvene this and we'll have another discussion to find out what more we've learned and what more we understand about these various companies. But for now, we leave it there and we say thank you very much for joining us, and I hope you have an absolutely lovely week. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thanks, Kyle. Thanks, Kyle.
Bye.